Welcome to my lecture on the House Divided, the US Civil War. Some people call it the War for Southern Independence. Some people call it the War of Northern Aggression. Some people call it the War between the States. I'm going to call it the US Civil War. Okay, so why even study the Civil War? Why is it so important? A total of 620,000 soldiers died, which was equal to 5% of the population at the time. Slavery died, which had been a curse on the nation pretty much ever since the nation was founded, and even before during the colonial days. The Union lived, so when we say the Union, we mean the United States of America, not the Confederate States of America, and warfare changed forever. So how did it come to this? Why did it even happen? What happened in the United States that made nearly half the nation want to secede? And here we have a picture of the Charleston Mercury, which was a newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina, celebrating the fact that the Union is dissolved. So, for me, one word: slavery. As the nation grew and new states were added, there was much disagreement about how those states should be admitted, slave or free. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 meant that in the new states of Kansas and Nebraska, around here, you'll see people could decide for themselves. So this was called popular sovereignty. You might think, oh, that's a great idea. Let the people decide whether they want the state to be slave or free. However, this really served to divide the nation along sectional lines like north and south, and cause fighting between pro and anti-slavery people in Kansas. It was actually referred to as Bleeding Kansas. So basically what it was was a lot of people on both sides moved into Kansas because they knew that if they moved there and they voted the way that they wanted it to go, then their side stood a better chance of prevailing. So lots of pro-slavery people went there from areas of the South, and lots of anti-slavery people went there from areas of the North, all in order to try and get their point of view across. So what is sectionalism? Well, as I alluded to previously, it's loyalty to one's region of the country rather than to the country as a whole. So I'm a Southerner rather than an American, is what somebody from South Carolina may have said in 1854. So what led to increase in sectionalism in the 19th century? When we say 19th century, of course, we mean 1800s. Well, they had different economic interests. In the South, it was a very agrarian economy built on tobacco, but the big one was cotton, also rice and indigo in the South Carolina Low Country. But really, cotton was king in the South. Whereas in the North, it was more based on trade and manufacturing. So there were more factories, there were more people making stuff. So sometimes they would take the cotton and turn it into clothes, and they would sell them. So it was more based on trade and manufacturing in the North. There were also different political interests. There was a strong national government. What people wanted in the North and the West, that means to say they wanted a strong federal government, whereas in the South, the people wanted strong state governments. So they didn't want a national government to tell them what to do. They wanted their state to be able to decide for themselves what was going to happen. So who was John Brown, and why does he matter? Brown had been an active abolitionist his entire life, and he was actually one of those people that with his sons, he moved from the north and went to Kansas following the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, and he participated in some attacks on pro-slavery supporters. In 1859, he led a raid on a government arsenal at Harper's Ferry, which is located in Virginia. He hoped to incite a slave rebellion. This is what all Southerners of a white persuasion wanted to avoid, was a slave rebellion, and he wanted to set up a state of freed slaves in the mountains of Maryland and Virginia. So this was a guy who actually, a place called Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, he beheaded somebody with a broadsword, who was a pro-slavery person. He really believed in that slavery was a curse on the nation and that could only be absolved of those sins through blood. So he went to Kansas and caused some riots there, and then in 1859, just a few years later, he tried to incite a slave rebellion. It was not successful, and what it did was serve to make Southerners even more paranoid about Northerners trying to take away their property. And when I say property, of course, I mean people, enslaved people. At about that time, 1859, 1860, the census, the population of the South, and if you include the border states of for example, Maryland and states like that, the population of the South was about 12 million, 8 million of whom were white Southerners, 4 million of whom were African American enslaved people. So it wasn't like a small number of people who potentially could be incited into a rebellion, and this was something that Southerners were very mindful of. And when we say Southerners in this context, I mean white Southerners. So the election of 1860 and Abraham Lincoln. The presidential election of 1860 was decided on sectional lines, meaning the North voted one way, the South voted another way. And basically, because the North had more people, they voted for Abraham Lincoln, who was the Republican anti-slavery candidate. So back then, the Republican Party was founded on basically an anti-slavery platform. They believed in free soil, so they wanted to halt the spread of slavery rather than allow it to continue in the new states that were opening up in the West. Led by South Carolina, though, the southern states refused to accept the outcome of this election, so they seceded, which means they left the Union and they formed their own government as the Confederate States of America, the CSA, or the Confederacy as most people know it. So they set up their own country. A few months later, in April 1861, South Carolina, their forces fired on Union forces at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and so began the bloodiest war in US history. So what you had was South Carolina troops under PGT Beauregard fired on the Union. So the troops, the federal troops who were manning the fort in Charleston Harbor, of course they surrendered because they were surrounded, and that began the war. So Americans firing on Americans, and at that point Lincoln said, okay, we got to stop this. I'm not allowing South Carolina and the other Confederate states to secede from this union. So the Civil War began 1861 and ended in 1865. You can see from the infographic there that the North had many advantages, primarily in people, in materials for war, and in terms of manufacturing capacity, and they had more money. So the conflict is between these two sides known as the Union, which is kind of the North, and the Confederacy, the South, about whether or not the Confederacy was allowed to leave the United States of America. Lincoln said no, the South said yes, we can. Like I said, the Union held considerable advantages in the number of troops and the amount of stuff they could manufacture. So guns and bullets and shoes and rifles and all of those kinds of things, and of course railroads to be able to move the troops and the war materials around the country. Like I said earlier, the North had about 20 million people, while the South had around 12 million, 4 million of whom were enslaved. Whoops, there we go. The majority of the fighting took place in the Confederacy or in the South. So while all this is going on, what is the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. He actually announced it in September 1862 and said in 90 days, this order is going to go into effect, and basically transformed the war from a disagreement about states' rights to a crusade for freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in rebel-held territories. So on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, and now every Union victory in the South was a victory for freedom. The British and other European powers sympathetic to the Confederacy could not enter the war because they would be entering on the side of slavery. Lincoln turned this war into a moral crusade. Even though it didn't actually free any slaves in Union-held areas, it was only in rebel-held areas, but it was used as a war measure as well as a way to promote the eventual freedom of enslaved peoples. Another important factor to consider in this war was the Battle of Gettysburg. So in the summer of 1863, so soon thereafter the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln, General Robert E. Lee led the Army of Northern Virginia into the North to try and bring the war home to Northerners and gain recognition by France and Britain. You'll remember that the Battle of Saratoga in the War for American Independence brought recognition for the United States by France, and this was a huge turning point in the war against the British. Well, Lee knew his history and sought to do the same. He wanted to take the war into the North, prove that the South could win, and it didn't happen. He met his match at a place called Gettysburg. He stopped there because his army needed shoes, and Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. And the battle was the bloodiest of the Civil War. Arguably, there were many bloody battles. 50,000 casualties. So Lee lost a third of his army. And the Army of Northern Virginia was really the spearhead of the Confederate Army. And so losing that many men in such a huge defeat was the turning point of the war. And so soon after, obviously, Lee and the Confederacy didn't just give up, but a couple of years later, Lee surrendered in a place called Appomattox in Virginia at the courthouse, and there he is offering his sword and hand to General Grant. And that is the end of the war.